Lineup decisions are becoming increasingly difficult each and every week. For fantasy, of the 8 teams remaining, the Chiefs, the Eagles, the Texans, and the Lions have allowed the fewest fantasy points to the running back position this season. Only the Commanders and Bills have allowed fantasy production inside the top 20. There happens to be a little bit of foreshadowing right there. It's time to break down the good, the bad, and the ugly for this week's fantasy football matchups and see what advantages we can give our rosters this week. Success is where preparation and opportunity meet, and at RotoBaller, we are prepared for success as we are here to help you with your divisional weekend starts and sits at the running back position. Starting with Derrik Henry of the Baltimore Ravens as they take on the Buffalo Bills. Baltimore signed Derrik Henry for the playoffs, even though Henry did finish with 1,921 rushing yards, second to only Saquon Barkley. This is what he was brought in for. In Henry's Ravens playoff debut, the bruising back would finish with 7.2 yards per carry against the Pittsburgh Steelers on his way to 186 rushing yards and a pair of rushing touchdowns. Those in one-and-done contests may be kicking themselves after leaving 31.6 fantasy points on the bench in hopes of preserving Henry for later in the playoffs. If you're one of those people, then this week I would strongly consider starting Henry once again. Assuming that the Chiefs beat the Texans in the other divisional contest, the Bills are the only favorable matchup remaining in the playoffs for running backs. If you want to keep the ball out of Josh Allen's hands, run it. When you face a team that has allowed 25.52 fantasy points per game this season to the position, the most of any playoff team and the third most in the NFL, this is as good of a matchup as you are going to find. This season, Buffalo, they've allowed 16 total touchdowns to backs, 10 on the ground, and 6 more in the passing game. They've also surrendered 1,629 rushing yards and a league-high 750 receiving yards to opposing backs. If you're looking for a sleeper play, Justice Hill is in a great spot to produce as well. Now, another running back that I love this week, it is Jir Gibbs of the Detroit Lions as they take on the Washington Commanders. While the Bills have been one of the worst fantasy defenses against opposing running backs, the Washington Commanders have the 30th ranked run defense this season. Of all the teams that qualified for the postseason, no one is allowing more rushing yards per game than the Commanders, who have allowed 135 yards per game this season and an average of 145 rushing yards per game on the road. While David Montgomery will certainly have a role this week, Jir Gibbs is the back that you want to plug into your lineup. Gibbs finished 5th in rushing yards this season with 1,412, averaging 5.65 yards per attempt. Gibbs, no question about it, was the most explosive back this season, as 10% of his runs resulted in gains greater than 15 yards, with 41.8% of his total rushing yards coming as a result of those explosive plays. Washington's run defense will need to find a way to bring Gibbs down to the turf. Only Henry, James Conner, and Bijan Robinson forced more missed tackles than Gibbs' 58, which earned him a missed tackles forced per attempt rate of 0.23 this season. On paper, Washington is completely outclassed in the trenches where the Lions' offensive line kept Gibbs clean, as the back would average 3.3 yards before contact per attempt this year. And the third running back that I'm going with, how about Saquon Barkley of the Eagles as they take on the Los Angeles Rams? There are only a handful of backs to choose from, and we are starting the back who faces one of the friendliest fantasy defenses this season. We're starting the back who faces a playoff team which has been allowing the most rushing yards per game, so it's only fitting that we fire up the back who led the league in rushing yards and fantasy points in Saquon Barkley this week. Sometimes you just have to pick that low-hanging fruit. Considering Barkley lost out on plenty of opportunities inside the 5-yard line, his 13 rushing touchdowns are that much more impressive. Of the Eagles' carries inside the 5-yard line, Barkley accounted for just 41.5% of them. For perspective, of running backs with at least 70 carries this season, that ranks 36th. Henry, Mixon, Chuba Hubbard, Breece Hall, James Conner, and Kyren Williams were all well over 70%. Barkley finished last week with 119 rushing yards on 25 attempts and easily could have added to that total after breaking through to that third level with under a minute remaining in the game, choosing to give himself up rather than add another 70 yards and a rushing touchdown to his box score. Barkley got his first taste of playoff victory, and he's acquired a thirst for more moving forward. Now, how about those running backs that I'm not moving forward with? It starts with Joe Mixon of the Houston Texans as they head to Arrowhead to take on the Kansas City Chiefs. Joe Mixon, he played a significant role in this Texans team advancing out of the wild card round last week against the Los Angeles Chargers. Mixon ran for 106 yards on 25 attempts, including a 17-yard touchdown run late in the fourth quarter, which put that game out of reach. Unlike Rex Ryan, I'm not going to say that the Chiefs have a bye this week, but things will be much more difficult for Mixon against Chris Jones and company this week. This season, the Chiefs allowed 101.8 rushing yards per game, the fifth fewest, and 96.5 yards per game on the ground in Arrowhead. For fantasy, no team allowed less production this season than the Chiefs, who allowed opposing running backs to average just 16.24 fantasy points per game. Running backs accounted for just 1,610 total yards and 9 touchdowns this season against Steve Spagnuolo's unit, who also happened to be the number 1 scoring defense in the league through 17 weeks. The second running back that I'm fading this week is Kyren Williams of the Minnesota Vikings as they head to Philadelphia to take on the Eagles. It doesn't matter who this Eagles defense is facing. Running backs are going to be in for a long day. Last week, Josh Jacobs, he had a successful day on the ground, running for 81 yards and a touchdown on 18 carries against that Eagles defensive front. Then again, 31 of those 81 yards came on just one play. On the season, that has not been the norm. Philadelphia is allowing 104.3 rushing yards per game this season. That is the 9th fewest, and the 16.35 fantasy points per game that they have conceded during the regular season are the 2nd fewest in the league, trailing only the Chiefs in that category. Kyren Williams is one of the best in the business when it comes to finding his way to the end zone. In the last 2 seasons, playoffs included, Williams has punched it in for 6 on 32 separate occasions. The unstoppable force meets the immovable object paradox is in play here this week as the Eagles allowed only 7 rushing touchdowns this season. And Philadelphia, they are arguably the best defense remaining in the playoffs. They rank first in total defensive DVOA, first in yards allowed, second in both pass and run DVOA, and third in touchdowns allowed. To make a long story short, just avoid anyone who's strapping on a helmet this week against the Eagles. And finally, I am sitting Isaiah Pacheco of the Kansas City Chiefs as they take on the Houston Texans. One of 2 things is or will happen this week. 1, the Chiefs are pulling the wool over all of our eyes and are set to unleash Pacheco in the playoffs yet again. Last season, Pacheco made a name for himself in these fantasy streets, rushing for 313 yards and 3 touchdowns in 4 postseason contests. The other possibility is that Pacheco, he is not 100%. Even after having the last 2 weeks off, in the first 2 weeks of the regular season, Pacheco posted 15.8 and 16.1 fantasy points, thanks to 189 total yards of offense and a touchdown. However, since he returned in week number 13, Pacheco's best outing came against the Chargers, where he had 61 total yards. In 5 games since he returned, Pacheco, he's averaging just 5 fantasy points per game. Much like the Chiefs and the Eagles, fantasy production has been challenging when facing this Houston Texans team. This season, opposing running backs are averaging just 18.72 fantasy points per game. That is the 3rd fewest. Houston was stingy up front, allowing just 1,466 rush yards, 476 receiving yards, and 10 touchdowns to the position. But you know who's not stingy? RotoBaller. So head over to rotoballer.com today for all the latest news and fantasy analysis, and head over to the RotoBaller Discord channel where you'll catch me there answering your questions 24/7. We'll see you next time.